Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we got some V4 changes. Yes, V4 changes. Usually there isn't all that much, however, there was a little bit this time, and let's get straight into it. So to start us off with Silverwolf, she received minor multiplier buffs basically across the board. Nothing all too special, but just minor buffs. And on top of this, her punchline to crit value conversion also got buffed from, I believe, 0.6% crit value per punchline to now being, I believe, 0.8% crit value, right? Or 0.8 just in general per punchline. So it received a pretty decent buff. It's like a 33% buff in total on that crit conversion, so pretty fucking good, to be honest. And then also the minor multiplier buffs, and her E1 apparently got changed so that now the damage increase on enemies doesn't only apply to her attacks, but actually the entire team's damage, which should also increase Sparksy value at higher investments, right? So definitely a buff at base, and an even further buff in terms of vertically investing in the team. Next, we move on to Evanessia. She also got basically minor buffs to a majority of her multipliers across the board. However, one thing that does kind of suck is it got nerfed her crit damage to elation increase conversion. So this went from, I believe, 25% of her crit damage scaling into elation, and it's now dropped to 20%. So I do believe she has been nerfed despite the multiplier buffs. However, in turn, I do believe her earlier eidolons have become stronger, right? In V3, her E1 had a part of it which gave 36% crit damage. Now that has been replaced with 20% res pen, which is obviously just way fucking stronger. However, the 36% crit damage has been swapped to her E2, which used to have the 20% res pen, so you'd assume it's worse. However, according to this leak, they've buffed a different part of her E2 to seemingly make up for this, in which she's able to convert significantly more certified banger generated from her teammates in comparison to before with the older E2, meaning she's able to gain a lot more energy after an aha instant goes off, which I do believe makes up for losing the res pen, making the E1 and E2 combo even stronger than it was before, right? And next, we have some pretty saddening news for probably quite a few out there. However, if you've seen recent showcases, you probably understand why they're doing this. EMC's 12% speed buff that he gives to an ally on ultimate is now gone, and it's been replaced with something basically useless, in which EMC gives himself a 100% crit damage buff. I think it's pretty obvious to most people why this is. They wanted Sparksy to be stronger than EMC, noticeably at that. EMC was getting way too close of clears, and because of opportunity cost, it was more worth it to go into other lanes of investment instead of picking up Sparksy, but now that's not the case, right? It seems like they want you to rely on pulling Sparksy instead of relying on EMC and just skipping Sparksy, so they're making her matter more as much as they can, right? And the last thing that I actually forgot to mention a little earlier when it came to the Silverwolf side of things, they did change her speed to elation conversion. However, there's kinda no difference. So for those who don't understand how her speed to elation conversion works, in V3, once you hit 150 speed, she would give herself 30 elation increase, and then for every 1 excess speed, she would increase this further by 2, right? In the new V4, she now gets a 50 elation increase. Now, people are for some reason thinking this is a buff. However, in reality, this doesn't really change much unless you play like Divergent Universe and you're getting copious amounts of speed. So basically now the speed requirement is 10 higher at 160. However, you get 50 elation. So keep in mind, this isn't a buff. 160 speed in V3 for Silverwolf and 160 speed in V4 will both end up giving the exact same amount of elation for Silverwolf. Some people are saying this is a buff, right? Because now technically the cap of speed you can hit on Silverwolf to gain elation is further away in comparison to before. You could make this argument, but once again, unless you're doing Divergent Universe or Currency Wars, I just don't really see anybody hitting like 260 plus speed, right? Like maybe Nihilux could be a fucking insane speed buffer for Silverwolf, and she's just leagues above any other option. However, even then, to introduce a character who gives that insane of a speed buff is a little unrealistic, because then they'd just be best in slot on every team by an absolute mile if they truly provided that much, right? However, maybe she is Cyrene-esque like the leaks are saying, and every single character gets a unique buff, and then anyone who isn't Silverwolf can't take advantage of that speed buff. Who knows? This is all just theory crafting. However, those are the V4 changes. TLDR, Silverwolf, minor buffs across the board, a slight change to her speed to elation conversion that doesn't really change much for the average player. The punchline to crit value conversion has gotten buffed by around 33%. Evanessia has gotten minor buffs to multipliers, slight nerf to her crit damage to elation conversion, and it seems buffs to both the E1 and E2, and EMC just has been straight up nerfed, removing his speed buff, since it seems they want to entice people into pulling Sparksy instead of just using EMC. So that is all for the V4 changes. Hope you all have a great day, hope you all have a great night, and peace out.